The last time we were together, we ended with the grandson of John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus II, on the throne of the Hasmonean Empire. Now, remember that he was the guy who was in charge of the army while his mother, Alexandra, ruled on the throne in Israel. Now, Aristobulus II beat his brother Hyrcanus II, who was serving as the high priest under his mother because Alexandra, being a female, was not qualified to be a high priest in Israel. Now, Aristobulus was backed by the Sadducees, and everything was good until an obscure Idumean entered into the scene. This man's name was Antipater. Now, Antipater saw in Hyrcanus the opportunity to fulfill his own dream of being a political power in Judea. Now, it's important to note that Antipater did not want to be king. He wanted to be the power behind the throne. And so he persuaded Hyrcanus that his brother was unjust in keeping the throne away from him, and he had a plan to put Hyrcanus back on the throne. So he worked it out so that the Nabatean Arabs would help him to take the throne back. Now, the Nabateans were located in modern Jordan, and their capital was Petra. They were a Semitic people. Now, there were some who believed that they were descended from Ishmael, and there were others who believed that they were descended from Esau. But either way, they were not descended from Jacob. And we know that they lived side by side with the people of Edom. And so that's why some people think that they were a cousin, if you will. That either way, Ishmael or Edom or Esau would work. But now this was how Antipater was able to get them to on his side. Hyrcanus agreed to Antipater's plan, and Aretas III and his Nabatean Arabs invaded Judea and besieged Jerusalem. Now, Aristobulus was caught completely by surprise. And so he shut himself up in Jerusalem, and he got ready for a long siege. And things were looking really bleak for Aristobulus. But next, on digging deeper, we see that there's more intrigue on the horizon with the entrance of the Romans. Learning about the quarrel between the brothers Aristobulus and Hyrcanus in Judea, Pompey, who was in the east in the interest of building up the Roman Empire there, took an immediate interest in Jewish politics. Under the guise of a willingness to arbitrate the difficulties, Rome became the force which was to determine the future of Judea. Pompey personally intervened to get to the root of the problem between the quarrel between these two brothers. Now, he observed evidences of the plan of Aristobulus to revolt against Rome. So a Roman army then besieged Jerusalem, and Hyrcanus supported Pompey against his brother. Now, the siege lasted for 3 months. And finally, the fortifications were breached, and 12,000 Jews were said to have been slaughtered in the battle that followed. Pompey, with his officers, entered the Holy of Holies in the temple. And this act scandalized the Jews, for none but the high priest ever had access to the Holy of Holies. And this was a desecration of their temple. Now, Pompey, to his credit, did not plunder the temple. He left its costly furnishings untouched, and he permitted the temple worship to continue. And Jerusalem was, in the words of Josephus, made a tributary to the Romans, and the last vestige of Jewish national independence was removed. But at least Aristobulus is not king. And so with what Pompey does, we're going to see something that's going to happen for the next 100 years, really until 70 AD, when Titus finally just has enough and destroys the city. And that is that the Romans and the Jews, they just did not understand each other. And so when Pompey went into the Holy of Holies, his goal there was not to desecrate the place, because he had no way of he had no frame of reference for that. And so that's why he was thinking that he was doing a good thing, but of course there was going to be some problems with the Romans and the Jews because of his actions. And we'll find again, this is just a first of a long list of problems that the Romans have with the Jews. Now, with the defeat of Aristobulus, Judea was made a part of the Roman province of Syria, and the non-Jewish cities east of the Jordan were removed from Judea. So Hyrcanus was rewarded for his loyalty to Pompey by being named the ethnarch of Judea, including the districts of Galilee, Idumea, and Perea. He was also confirmed as the high priest, and a yearly tribute was paid to Rome, and Aristobulus and a number of other captives were taken as prisoners to grace Pompey's triumph and triumphal entry into Rome. Now, en route to Rome, Aristobulus' son, Alexander, escaped and attempted to organize a revolt against Hyrcanus. With the aid of the Romans, Hyrcanus was able to meet this challenge to his authority. Alexander was forced to surrender, but his life was spared. Now, meanwhile, to the east of Jerusalem, there's trouble brewing by the name of Antipater, who is a schemer from Idumea. Now, Antipater, also known as Antipas, was the governor of Idumea, and he took an interest in Jewish politics. Now, we know that he was friendly with Hyrcanus, and he absolutely detested Aristobulus. It appears that Hyrcanus relied much on Antipater, who became the virtual power behind the throne, and that was what he wanted to do. So the Jewish people resented Antipater almost as much as they resented being a vassal of Rome. Now, Antipater was an Idumean or an Edomite. The Edomites had been hereditary enemies of the Jews for literally centuries, and that they were pushed north from their ancestral home to the south of the Dead Sea by the Nabatean Arabs. Now, under John Hyrcanus, the Idumeans had been forcibly incorporated into the Jewish nation, and the antipathy continued. Now, Antipater, however, did not let this hinder him from seeking an ever-increasing amount of power under Hyrcanus and his Roman overlords, and from seeking positions of influence for his sons, Phasael and Herod. Now, the only son that matters to us in this discussion is Herod. Herod was the second son of Antipater, the patriarch of the Herodian dynasty. He became known as Herod the Great, and his successors to the throne were granted the title Herod when they took the throne. Thus, there are actually 6 different men in the Gospels and the book of Acts referred to as Herod. Now, we need to go back to Rome to follow the rise to power of Herod. Herod's father, Antipater, became personal hero of the Caesars by protecting Julius Caesar's life. He then began the Herodian tradition of following whoever was in power. And so in the crisis that followed the murder of Julius Caesar, Antipater and his sons showed their loyalty to the new regime of Cassius by zealously collecting tribute, in other words, robbing the people blind. And Herod was so successful in collecting taxes that Cassius actually appointed him as the ruler of all Syria. And Herod was given the title, the procurator or the governor of Judea, now with the promise that he would one day be named king. Now, if we remember that Pilate also held this title of procurator of Judea, because what it meant was he was the agent of Rome. Now, the thing that's fascinating for me is this, is that remember that Antipater is exalted because he saves the life of Julius Caesar, and then he joins sides with Julius's murderers, Cassius and Brutus. Now, but it gets better. When Antony defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, then Asia fell into the hands of the new Roman regime. And Herod, ever the opportunist, quickly changed his loyalties, and he bribed his way to favor with Antony. Now, meanwhile, the Parthians, who occupied a part of the eastern territory of the once mighty Persian Empire, had not been conquered by Rome, And in 41 BC, they attacked and they took Jerusalem, and they made Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, king and high priest. Remember, Aristobulus II was the brother of Hyrcanus, and they were the two brothers under Alexandra. And so now they make Antigonus the king and high priest. Now Herod, the son of Antipater, who had inherited the throne of Judea at the death of Hyrcanus, was forced to flee to Rome. And there he won the favor of Antony, who gave him the title the King of the Jews, which was to have meaning only after the Parthians were driven out. And so the Roman forces helped Herod in this military operation, and they kicked the Parthians out, and Herod came in to power. Now, Herod's family life was closely related to his political life, and it was just as complicated. Herod married Doris from Jerusalem, but most likely she was of Idumean descent. Now, Doris was the mother of Herod's first son, Antipater, named after his grandfather. During this time, Herod was betrothed to Mariamne. We know Mariamne I, who was the granddaughter of both brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. She was also the niece of Antigonus. It's just like we're in Kentucky all over again, who was Herod's arch rival. Now, this betrothal secured many political advantages for Herod. By marrying Mariamne, he would marry into the Hasmonean royal family, securing him the position of regent upon Hyrcanus' death. Now, since Mariamne was Hasmonean and not Idumean, then Herod gained acceptance into Judean circles as well. Now we know that Herod's rule spanned the eventful years from 37 BC all the way up to 4 BC. Now, the first 10 years witnessed a concerted effort to consolidate his powers, strengthening his control over this unsettled portion of the Roman Empire. Herod faced opposition from the remaining Hasmonean family members, the Jewish people, and the Pharisees, the ruling class of Judea, and even Cleopatra of Egypt herself. Now, the Pharisees were the most present threat to Herod, because the Pharisees did not think that Herod was the rightful ruler. Since he was Idumean, he was not even full-blooded Jewish, nor was he from the family of David, or from the family of Judah. He was completely outside. Now, the fact that Herod was a friend of the opposing Romans, it didn't help his standing at all. It didn't help his standing before the Pharisees, didn't help his standing before the people either. Now, Herod's tactic in dealing with the people was to punish those who were against him while rewarding those who were on his side. So the ruling class sided with Antigonus, who also claimed that Herod was not the rightful ruler. So Herod's solution to this threat was to execute 45 of the most wealthy and prominent of the aristocracy. Their properties were confiscated, and Herod's coffers were replenished as the result of their deaths. So the Hasmoneans, the previous dynasty in Judea, also maintained that Herod was not a rightful ruler. Although Herod had married into the family, it was his mother-in-law, Alexandra, who was the most resistant to Herod. Since Hyrcanus had been mutilated somehow, he was therefore no longer qualified to serve as high priest. And so Herod needed to appoint a replacement. And so Herod installed Ananel, who was an insignificant priest of the Zadokite family, considered to be a descendant of Moses' brother Aaron, so of the Aaronic priesthood. This guy was actually qualified. This is kind of crazy. We actually had somebody who was qualified to be a high priest. But Alexandra took this as an insult to the Hasmonean dynasty and insisted that her son Aristobulus III should have this position. So Alexandra solicited help from Cleopatra of Egypt, who then put pressure on Herod through Antony. Through Mariamne, Herod's wife, also put pressure on her husband to have her brother installed as the high priest. So Herod gave in to this pressure and unlawfully removed Ananel and made Aristobulus III high priest at 17 years of age. Now, Herod and Alexandra never really trusted each other again. Alexandra, in fact, attempted to escape from Jerusalem to Egypt with her son. But Herod uncovered the plot, causing him to keep a closer eye on his mother-in-law, keeping her close to him. Now, Aristobulus III was gaining in popularity. And remember, he was the son of Alexandra, who was actually a very popular ruler. So, and because her son was gaining popularity, Herod felt compelled to eliminate this Hasmonean threat to his throne. So at Jericho, Herod was Alexandra's guest, and he invited Aristobulus to go swimming to cool off from the Judean heat. Now, some of his swimming companions had been bribed by Herod, and they drowned him. And Herod mourned greatly for this long-lost brother-in-law whom he loved dearly. And he held a magnificent funeral. But Alexandra didn't trust him, knew what happened, and devoted her life to avenging the mysterious death. Again, she called on Cleopatra to engage Antony in putting pressure on Herod. And so Herod was called to Rome to answer for his charges. And Antony had the power to sentence Herod to death, and so Herod put his wife under a careful watch. And his instructions to a man by the name of Joseph was to assassinate her if by chance he was killed in Rome. Because he didn't want her to become another man's lover, because apparently Mariamne was beautiful and he was jealous. Now, Mariamne's guard, Joseph, was the one who was tasked by Herod to kill her if anything happened. Now, nothing happened to Herod. He was back, but Mariamne was accused of infidelity with Joseph, and Herod found out about it, and answered that, and he figured the best thing to do was just have Joseph killed without an opportunity to defend himself. And so Alexandra was also put in chains and placed under guard for her role in this whole sordid affair, because there was a false accusation, and so the best way to deal with that is just kill the guy. Now, in addition to her role with Alexandra, Cleopatra was also a threat to Herod. So Cleopatra was gaining more control of the region, and Herod was eventually forced to turn over some of the most fertile areas of his territory to her. When Antony was defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium, Herod had to prove his right to the Judean throne to Octavian, and he was successful. And Octavian confirmed Herod in his royal position. Herod was able to see which way the wind was blowing, and because he had no ethics, he was able to adapt to whoever was in power, because he was a master at picking the winner and then ingratiating himself to the power at the time. So, Herod is making himself more powerful. He is solidifying his rule and his reign, but all was not good in Judea. See, while Herod was away in Rome defending himself before Octavian, his wife, Mariamne, and his mother-in-law, Alexandra, learned of the secret plan to execute them and to keep the kingdom out of their hands. And furthermore, Herod's sister, Salome, took the opportunity to spread rumors about Mariamne, who was the favored wife of Herod, and to turn him against her. And so Salome accused Mariamne of committing adultery with the man that Herod had appointed to kill her if anything happened to him. Now, we know that Herod dismissed the charge after talking to his wife, but since that didn't work, Salome then bribed Herod's butler to say that Mariamne had prepared a poisonous quote-unquote love potion for the king. Now, the butler refused to give any details. He didn't have any details so he didn't give any details to Herod. And so Herod found Mariamne's favored eunuch and tortured him until he confessed. Now, he had no knowledge of the love potion because of the poison, because there was no poison, but he did have knowledge to the fact that Mariamne knew that she was supposed to be killed if things didn't go well with Octavian. Now remember, we already been through this once with Antony. Now we're going through it again with Octavian. And so that Herod had tasked a man by the name of Sohemus to murder Mariamne, or to kill Mariamne if anything happened to him. Now, what Herod believed, that the only way that Mariamne would be able to find out about this is if she was actually having an affair with Sohemus, otherwise he wouldn't have told her. And so he became convinced that Mariamne had been unfaithful with Sohemus. And so Sohemus was executed immediately. Mariamne, however, was tried. She at least had the opportunity to be tried, and she was ultimately executed in 29 BC. And we know that Herod, it says, mourned deeply for her, because I believe that he actually cared about her. The problem was he was becoming more and more paranoid as he was getting older. Now, at the same time here, Herod's health began to fail. And Alexandra, his mother-in-law, began to secure her position on the throne should Herod die. So Herod learned of this threat, and of course, in Herodian fashion, he had her executed. Now, then the last of the Hasmonean males, he had executed in 25 BC. Herod had executed his sister, Salome's first husband, and gave her to Costoborus, an Idumean of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, Costoborus plotted with Cleopatra against Herod, and Herod found out about the plan and only spared his life as a favor to his sister. And everything worked out well until Salome grew tired of her husband and turned her brother against him. And she told him that Costoborus was plotting to overthrow Herod and take the throne. So Herod found him and executed him. Why not? Along with a number of innocent men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then Salome was then free of her husband, and Herod was free of the Hasmonean threat to the throne. So everything's going well, right? Well, the next time that we come together, I want to finish the legacy of Herod. And I want to talk about this. I want us to see this today, okay? Herod was a despicable person. But the rise of Herod shows us once again what happens when people move away from the God that they are supposed to serve. You see, once the people accepted a king that was not qualified to be king by God's standards, there was going to be a downward spiral. And this began with the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans were not from the tribe of Judah. They were not from the lineage of David. They were priests. They were from the line of Levi. And they were not qualified to be king. And once you get outside of God's standards, you're going to have a downward spiral. And we know that leading is hard enough. But leading without God is a recipe for disaster. And now we see in Israel's history, we see righteous men. I mean, just think about it. Zerubbabel, who was from the kingly line of Judah, refused to be made king. And he served as governor because he was a godly man and he would not go against the directives of God. And he was blessed because of it. And we hear incredible things by the prophet Hosea that they write about this incredibly godly man. Because you see, Zerubbabel knew that the only person who could be qualified to be king must have a legal father from David. He did. But that father could not be his biological father, because then he would no longer be qualified to be king. So he must have a mother from David, but not from the kingly line. And Zerubbabel did not fit that criteria. In fact, the only person in the history of humanity that has ever fit that criteria is Jesus. He had a father, Joseph, from the kingly line of David. His mother was from David through another son, Nathan. And the next time we're together, we'll see the terrible things that happened when the people, first of all, decide for themselves what's right and wrong, but also what happens when you have somebody who is ungodly, thinking only for themselves, and they come face to face with God at work in human history and doing things the right way. And we see this incredible clash between the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of God and how they will never get along. And so, first of all, thank you for making it to the end. I know that there's just a lot of intrigue. I went really fast through this but there's just, I mean, there's just, the life of Herod is the life of a soap opera. And it just gets worse. We'll talk about that the next time that we are together. But I really want you to think about this, is that it matters that the leadership that we put in power are godly people. When they're not, you end up with a downward spiral of debauchery, and you end up with everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, and we have people calling evil good and good evil, and all of the things that we're seeing in our world today. Why is that? Because we have ungodly people who are in control. And Herod is just one example of a long list. And so I pray that you are challenged by these words today, that you're encouraged, that we're not just learning stuff for the sake of learning it, but that we actually get a chance to see that it really does matter. And I really want you to think about the fact of how good God is, that God sent us Jesus, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is the one who's in control of the kingdom of God. And because of that, we can worship him, we can serve him, and we know that he is the one who's going to ultimately right the wrong that was started in the garden. And so I pray that as you gather with your siblings in Christ this week, that you have an incredible time in God's presence. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.